Welcome to Los Angeles Data Platform User Group. Thank you very much for everyone who has joined us today. I'm Thimanta, and I'm your host for today. Along with me is Steve, who will be managing the social media streaming services for us. And also we have Elena, who will be handling the referral at the end of the session today. If you're attending our sessions for the very first time, please do follow us. So we have all the social media platforms in the screen right now. So you can simply follow us and to be in touch with any future events as well. Also, please do make sure that you join in to our mailing list, so that way you would be getting weekly newsletters as well as any notifications regarding events as well. So this session, typically this event is sponsored by Data-Driven Technologies. So the Data-Driven Technologies is the organization behind Los Angeles Data Platform User Group monthly meetups, which are the meetups that we have monthly. So we are currently in the July meetup, and typically Data-Driven Technologies also organize the once a year mega event, where a SQL Saturday event as well, which you can call it Data Saturday right now. So that SQL Saturday Los Angeles actually. So that is being organized by Data-Driven Technologies as well. And in terms of announcements, we'll be having SQL Saturday this year as well on August 13, 2022. Typically, it's a free training event for professionals who use the Microsoft Data Platform. This community or event offers content across data management, cloud and hybrid architecture, analytics, business intelligence, AI, and much more. So please do register for the event, and it's an in-person event, so you can attend it you are more than welcome to attend the event in person. By the end of the event, we'll also be having a raffle draw where you can also join in and by scanning through the QR code and and entering your name. And by the if you win, you can actually win a custom T-shirt. The session for today is managing high availability disaster recovery with DBATools, which is presented by Frank Gill. During the presentation, if you do have any questions, please do make sure that you drop these questions in the chat, or alternatively, you can unmute yourself and ask these questions as well. Without further ado, I would like to hand it over to the speaker. So take it away, Frank. It's all yours. Thank you very much for joining with us today. So it's all yours, Frank. Thank you.
All right. So I am going to talk about managing HADR with DBATools. A little bit about me. I've been in IT for 23 years now, the last 15 of it working with SQL Server. Started out as a traditional DBA. The last 7 years I've been working as a consultant, currently working for a company called Fortified Data as a senior consultant. I love to learn, and presenting is a really good way to do that. I'm really interested in internals. A lot of the things I present about are internals based. This is not one of them, but PowerShell is something else that I've become really passionate about, and DBATools is a really great way to kind of get involved with PowerShell and SQL Server. In the before times, before the lockdown, I was a volunteer at the Art Institute of Chicago. It's one of my favorite places in the world. And then my contact information is here. You can hit me up on Twitter or email. I have not been blogging as much as I would like. Something that I keep telling myself I'm going to do, but it just hasn't happened. Just briefly, what we're going to cover, I'm going to talk about DBA Tools and what it is, then talk about various high availability and disaster recovery options in SQL Server. And then I'm going to be using Azure Data Studio notebooks to run my demos. So I'll give you a brief overview of what those are, and then talk through configuring log shipping with DBA Tools, returning information, monitoring and returning information about failover cluster instances with DBA Tools, and then finally creating, configuring, and monitoring availability groups with DBA Tools. And as was said, if you got questions as I'm going through, feel free to ask. I'll pause periodically and ask if anybody has any questions. So to get into what DBA Tools is, if you look at the DBA Tools website, it is the community module that enables SQL Server pros to automate database development and server administration. My take on it is that along with Ola Hollengren's maintenance solution and baseballreference.com, it's one of the coolest things on the internet. It's a community developed PowerShell module. It started out as a migration tool, and it still works very well as a migration tool. There is a command called start migration, and at its simplest, you give it a source instance and a destination instance, and it will move everything. Databases, logins, link servers, you name it, it will move it. And it is incredibly customizable. The first time I ran it, I nearly cried because I have been through some very, very painful migrations, and it would have really simplified my life. There are currently over 500 commands available, and they're adding functionality as things change in SQL Server, as they figure out there are more things they want to do. So the important thing here is the automate piece. What I'm going to be talking about in terms of log shipping and availability group setup, these are things that you can do using T-SQL. These are things you can do using Management Studio. But if you are setting up log shipping or availability groups on a regular basis, you want things to look the same. So by using the DBA Tools commands and building scripts that are parameterized, you have the ability to standardize these builds. So as I said, you can configure these things using Management Studio, which is great for one time. T-SQL scripts can be generated, but you've got to update those scripts. You can do find and replace, but it's not great for standardizing and automating. Being able to pass parameters into a script makes these things reusable. To get DBA Tools, if you can run a PowerShell administrator window on a server, you just type install module DBA Tools. You will be asked to accept an update for the NuGet package, which is how it's pulling the modules down. And then it will ask you if you actually want to install the module. Once you do that, you're done, and you can run these commands. You can also run remotely. So I'm currently running a migration where we only have admin rights on a handful of servers in the environment, able to drop DBA Tools on those boxes and then administer the other servers from there. Documentation for DBA Tools is available at dbatools.io. And then there are additional options for getting a hold of DBA Tools if you don't have admin rights or you don't have the ability to run install module. There are about 5 different options, and they're all documented at the DBA Tools site. These are the categories of commands that are available. I would say anything that you can do in SQL Server, there is a command here for you. And also I have learned the lesson multiple times. If I want to do something in SQL Server using PowerShell, always check here first, because chances are they have done it, and they have done it better than I could. The 3 categories I'm going to focus on are availability groups, log shipping, and Windows Server failover cluster. And then finally, the authors of this book, Chrissy Lemaire, Rob Sewell, Jess Pomfret, and Claudio Silvia, are the drivers behind the DBATools project. Chrissy Lemaire started it. As I said, she started it as a way to make her migrations easier. And Rob, Jess, and Claudio have all jumped in to help develop things. This book, Learn DBATools in a Month of Lunches, just published at the beginning of June. And it's a really, really good way to kind of get your feet wet with DBATools. It's published by a company called Manning, and one of the nice things they have is you can buy an electronic copy of the book, and that gets you not only a PDF version or a Kindle version, whatever format you want it in, but they have what's called Live Book, and this is an online version of the book. You log into the Manning website and you can browse it. And I actually wrote this presentation waiting to get my oil, or started writing the presentation waiting to get my oil changed, and I pulled up the Live Book on my phone and was able to kind of put the outline together. So enough about DBATools. Talk about high availability and disaster recovery options in SQL Server. The three I'm going to talk about are log shipping, failover cluster instance, and availability groups. And I should have paused there to see if anybody has any questions. If not.
Does DBATools require specific PowerShell version, like 5, 6?
It will run, basically, it depends. So I believe 5 is the version that they recommend. I think there is stuff in it that will run as far back as 3, but I think that 5 right now is what they're recommending as the base version. I can confirm that.
And I assume that DBATools runs on Linux as well, right?
Yes, that's not something I've done, but yes, I believe that it will work on Linux because you can now run PowerShell on Linux. Once again, I think there's certain things that may not work the same way on Linux than Windows, but you can install and run the commands for sure.
Thank you.
So the first thing I'll talk about is log shipping. Log shipping has been around forever, or SQL Server 2000, which is good enough. And basically log shipping, you can, in Management Studio, you can run through a wizard and set this up. And basically what log shipping does is it runs log backups on a primary instance, and then copies those log backup files to a secondary instance, and then a job runs to restore the log backup files on the secondary. You can roll your own, as long as you can run a backup job, a copy job, and a restore job, you can set this up. You have limited read-only capability on the secondary, and I'll show that in my demo. And one of the nice things about this is that it's pretty bulletproof. If one of these 3 phases fails, the other phases will continue to run. And once you get the failing phase worked out, it will pick up and restore the files that it may have missed. I ran into an example of this with a client, and they were doing log shipping between data centers, and over a weekend, the network connection between the data centers dropped. So the backups were still running, and they were being run to an intermediate location, but the copy to the secondary site was failing because of that network failure. So Monday we got the network people on the phone, restored that connection, and as soon as that connection was restored, files were copied over, and the restore picked up and was able to kind of heal itself. So it's like I said, a fairly bulletproof technology. That's going to take me into an overview of Azure Data Studio notebooks, just because I'm going to jump into those for my demo. So Azure Data Studio, it is a tool like SQL Server Management Studio, but it is available for cross-platform. So you can run it on Windows, you can run it on Mac, you can run it on Linux. And the Azure name is somewhat misleading because you can connect to both on-prem and Azure instances. it contains an integrated terminal so that you can run PowerShell commands from the command line. You can run command line commands from the terminal at the same time you are running T-SQL or PowerShell scripts within Azure Data Studio. And then it allows creation and execution of Jupyter notebooks. And notebooks are, it's a single file. A notebook is a single file that contains both formatted text and runnable code. And you run each notebook under a kernel. And the kernels that are available are SQL Server, PowerShell, and that's what I'm going to be running. And then you've got Spark and Python. Jupyter notebooks were initially developed as a machine learning tool. So that's why you've got Spark and Python. And then Microsoft has taken them and applied the SQL Server and PowerShell kernels to them. Uses demo code, right? So you're going to see that in a minute. You can standardize configuration. Once again, that the log shipping demo I'm going to go through is an example of that. You can build this notebook, you can store it, and then when somebody on your team needs to set up log shipping, they can run through the steps in the notebook and build out log shipping as you expect it to be built out. And then finally, runbooks. If you have, for example, if you do support and you run into an error, you can put together a notebook for how to diagnose and repair or fix that error in a notebook and give people kind of step-by-step code to run through. So with that, over to my first demo. So this is my notebook. As I said, you've got formatted text and then code, and each of these code blocks has a play button. I believe I've already removed log shipping, but let me just verify. Window. Come on. All right, so I've got two instances of SQL Server. I have a default instance from my laptop and then highlighted in blue named instance called Tony. On the default instance, I have the worldwide importers database, and let me just expand it out. Jobs. So let me just run this while we're waiting. Okay. Yeah. All right. So log shipping is currently not configured. As I said, log shipping consists of three phases: the log backup, the copy, and the restore. So this next code block is going to configure log shipping for me. Because I'm running a demo local to my machine, all of the paths that I'm writing to are local. So I've got a path that I am going to be writing my backup files to, a shared path that I'm copying those files to, and then a path that I am using to do the restores. Excuse me. This next block of code, this params, this is what's called a splat. So a PowerShell command, in this case invoke DBA log shipping, takes a list of parameters. And if you're familiar with PowerShell, that parameter will be a dash and then the parameter name followed by a value. What this params block, the splat, allows me to do is define all of these parameters in a block and then reference them using this @params. And just to step through these quickly, I have my source instance, which is my default, my destination instance, which is that named instance, the database that I am going to log ship, the shared path and the local path. And then these next parameters are the frequency and information about the jobs. So I got the backup job, the copy job, and the restore job. You can see that the backup schedule, actually I want to set these to true because I don't want the backup jobs running while I'm running my demo. If you were doing this for real, you would want to set that to false. And it defaults to run these jobs every 15 minutes. And you can modify that if you want to run it more frequently, less frequently. But that is the default, both for the wizard, if you were to build this using Management Studio, or this tool. And then finally, force. This is just not going to prompt me for anything while I run this. Standby, this I mentioned that you have limited read-only capability. So by setting standby equal to true, while the restore jobs aren't running, the log shipped, the secondary is readable. You can read from it. You can't alter it, but you can read from it. The thing you've got to remember here is that the restore can't run if there's anyone connected to the database. So this disconnect users parm says, before you run the restore, kick everybody out of the database. So that's how that read-only is limited, because if you're pulling data, that restore runs, it's going to kill your session. So you just have to keep that in mind. So I'm going to run this, and if the gods are with me, it will run fairly quickly. Come back over here. We take a look at jobs. Okay, so you can see that I've got my ls test dr standby read only. And one other thing I didn't mention, there's a secondary database suffix parm here, and that dr is appended onto that secondary database. And then looking at the agent jobs on my primary, you can see I've got this ls backup, ls test, which is disabled, but that job was created by the process. And then if I look at my jobs on the secondary side, but I should be able to see my jobs. The electrons don't have to go that far. Give me 1 second. So let's see if I can figure out what's going on. Okay, so now I've got my ls copy and ls restore jobs out here. So those are the copy and restore jobs. So let's see. That's not going to work. I'm not sure why it's taking so long. Well, while that runs, I'm going to run this stuff from Management Studio.
By the way, Frank,
Yep.
to run PowerShell with DBATools inside Azure Data Studio, do you have to download any extension?
So you do. You don't have to install an extension, but I will give you a link to this code. And the first time that you open this notebook, It will default to the PowerShell kernel, and within Azure Data Studio, it will do a download of the code that it needs to run this. So it takes about 5 or 10 minutes, but it will, it'll prompt you. You get a pane on the right-hand side. It says, I need to download this stuff. Do you want me to? You click OK, and it just runs through and downloads everything it needs.
Got it. Thank you.
No problem. All right, so that's the wrong database. Execute. Okay. Like I said, I'm still not sure why this is still clocking, because it looks like it's done everything it needs to do. So invoking this has kicked off those 3 phases. It's run a backup of the LS test database on the primary. It's copied the files to the various locations, and then it's run a restore. So if I run this select, there's a single table in the database. It has 1 row in it that contains this information. So this is on the secondary side. I've got 1 row, columns 2 and 3 read log shipping. I run the same thing against the default instance. I do it against the right database. You can see the same values. All right, so I wanted to be able to do this stuff all through Azure Data Studio. Because that is still running, I can't. So I'm going to insert a row into, let's do this. I insert a row into my test table on the primary side. And now what I do is select on the primary side, I have 2 rows. If I open another window, connect to my secondary, and run that same select, just have the 1 row because I haven't executed any of my log shipping jobs at this point. I'm going to stop that and see what that does for me. So I've run this insert via Management Studio, 2 rows, and I can actually run this. Let's see what's there. Okay, I don't know why that defaulted, but so I ran this select statement against both instances, the primary and the secondary. And here you can see in the results that I have 2 rows on the primary side, 1 row on the secondary, on the Tony side. So now I'm going to run 3 DBATools commands to execute 3 jobs. And a cool parm that exists here is this wait. So this will kick off the job, in this case, the backup. It will wait until it completes before it runs the next one. That will run the copy, wait until it completes, and then run the restore. So this should take about 15 seconds. And it's going to make a liar out of me again. I have apparently not made appropriate sacrifices to the demo gods. I'm not sure what's going on here. All right, so backup finished. Give it another minute or so to run the other two jobs. All right, copy completed. Just waiting on the restore. Okay, so the restore is completed. Now, if I run the select from both sides, you'll see that I've got the two rows on both sides. So the backup and restore took the data from the primary side, pushed it to the secondary side. So, you know, log shipping can be used for that read-only capability, but it is mainly a disaster recovery tool. So if something goes wrong with your primary site, you can flip over to the secondary. So this next block of code is going to simulate a failure of the primary side. It is going to stop the SQL Server service on the primary. It is going to stop all of the processes running against the LS test DR database on the secondary side. And then it's going to run invoke DBA log ship recovery, which will effectively kick off those three steps one more time, and then bring the Tony database, which is currently in standby read only, it will bring it into a restoring state. So kick this off and hopefully it'll run more quickly. So I'm waiting for the service to stop. Okay, the service has stopped. It has executed the kill. And then you'll notice that it is spitting out the names of all of the databases on my secondary side, because it just looks at all of the databases and then it finds the ones that are set up for log shipping, and it will bring those back online. So that's still running. Let me refresh this. All right, it's still running because it's running through the process again of the backup, copy, and restore. A minute to finish. I don't know if it's the Teams meeting that's slowing things down, but this was running quicker than the tests I ran this afternoon. It's run faster than the other times I've run it. I apologize for the delay. So the next steps, I'm going to select from the table on Tony just to show you that those two rows that already existed were there. And then because the database is recovered, I should be able to write to it. So I was going to run an insert and insert a third row into that table, and then just show you that that insert worked successfully because the database was no longer in read-only. Let's see if this came back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep rolling with my presentation, and then I'll come back to this and after this completes and show you that that actually worked. Any questions about log shipping? If not, talk about SQL Server failover cluster instances. So failover cluster instance is an instance of SQL Server that is running on as a clustered resource on a Windows Server failover cluster. An FCI contains at least two nodes, a primary and a secondary, and you can have, actually I'm not sure how many you can have, but I've seen I cut my teeth on a clustered environment that was one primary and three secondaries. One node in the cluster is always running as a primary and hosts the clustered resources. And one of the things that's kind of challenging about this is that you need shared storage. So because the failover cluster instance is happening at the instance level, the drive that your data and log files live on has to be visible to all of the nodes in your failover cluster. And when you fail over, all of those, basically the SQL Server service on the current primary shuts down, and the instance that you're failing to, the services start up and all of the cluster resources switch to that new primary. Failovers at the instance level, so all of your system databases, master, MSDB, all move. So logins, jobs, all of that stuff will fail over. Because the setup of an FCI is dependent on setting up a Windows Server failover cluster, DBATools doesn't have commands to provision an FCI, but it does have commands for returning information about them. And this can be really useful for gathering information about clusters in an environment. As a consultant, I'll go into an environment and I can run these commands against the entire environment and pull back information about all the clusters that are running. And you can run this remotely to build that inventory. I'm just going to highlight a couple of the commands that are available. Get DBAWFC node. You pass it a computer name and it will return, if that computer is part of a cluster, it will return all of the information about the nodes in that cluster. So in this case, running it against my server 1, it tells me that my server 1 and my server 2 are both participating as nodes in the cluster. Gives me the FQDN and the cluster name. The FQDN for the cluster and the cluster name along with the nodes. The next one is WFC SFC role, and it returns all of the roles that are associated with the cluster. So in this case, I've got my available storage, my cluster group, and then my cluster name. And then finally, get DBAWFC resource. So I mentioned that on failover, the cluster resources move. And so this will detail all of those resources for me. Once again, all I need is the name of one of the nodes in the cluster to pull this information back. And here you'll see that get the physical disks. So in this case, this would be a data disk and a log disk. The SQL Server service, the SQL Server agent service. So those are all clustered resources, and those are all going to move on failover. So once again, I can't build the cluster from here, but by using these commands, I can pull back this information and quickly build an inventory. And you can output the results of these commands to CSV. You can output them to a table directly. So it's a quick and easy way to build an inventory of information about an FCI environment. So that is, yeah.
Sorry for question about log shipping, but in the DBA tools, when you set up log shipping, what happens to the regular backups of logs? So let's say you have a bad database that gets backed up, let's say every day, and differential every hour, and let's say you have a T-log backup every 15 minutes.
Yep.
With adding log shipping, how that actually going to interact with each other?
So in that case, I would stop I would remove. So if I'm log shipping, in this case, database ls test, I would remove ls test from that standard log backup schedule, and then use the log shipping backups for your recovery, because they won't, I mean, you can run them both, but that gets really complicated to try to restore from. So, I mean, if you do want to set up log shipping, that would be how I would handle it. And then if you do need to recover your primary, you would use those log shipped databases. You can write them at the same location if you want. There's nothing to say you can't. It just, you need to know what's going on, and that log shipping is configured.
Can you use DBA tools partially just to restore? So let's say you already have log backups. Can you rely on DBA tools just to restore?
Yep. Yeah, and actually I'm actually literally running a migration right now. I've got to finish it up after I'm done with this. And we're using the Restore DBA database. And the cool thing about that is that you point it, so I can run it, restore a full backup, and then I can run it again and set parameters to say, look at this path that has, 1,000 log backups in it, and it will actually pull the header information for each one of those backup files, and then pull the last LSN from the database, and it will only apply the log backups that are good, that will bring that database up to, up to current. So it, like I said, DBA tools, it just, if you have thought about trying to do it with PowerShell and SQL Server, check DBA tools, because they most probably have the functionality there. So yeah, you can just use it for the restore, and it's really
you were talking about use last backup.
Yep.
Yep.
So, all right.
And in terms of the failover cluster, you're saying that there is only get, there is no set.
Correct. Yeah, because I mean, basically, you've got to build out that failover cluster, which is, all on the Windows side. And because DBA Tools is SQL focused, they don't have those commands. PowerShell commands exist to do that stuff. It's just not in the wheelhouse of DBA Tools.
Got it. Thank you.
All right. So my log shipping switchover finally worked. So let me just make sure that this worked. So if I do a select, you can see that I've got the 2 rows on the Tony side. If I come over and look at the database in here, it is, what is going on? Refresh. It's still showing a standby, which it should not be doing. Let me just see if I can insert to it. And it, what the hell happened? Something went wrong. That's helpful. Database is in use. Son of a. Let's disconnect all these queries. Just going to try running this by itself. Let that run, continue rolling, and then come back. All right, so that brings us to availability groups. Availability groups are a feature that was introduced in 2012, and they have been improved in every version since 2012. An availability group runs on top of a Windows Server failover cluster, but unlike an FCI, there is no shared storage. The failover cluster basically acts kind of as a traffic cop to tell SQL Server where the availability group is running, what replica it's running on. There is no shared storage, so you can have up to 8 secondary replicas. So I've got a primary and at least 1 and up to 8 secondary replicas. Each one of those secondary replicas has its own local copies of the data and log files for the availability group database. The databases are contained in that availability group, and one instance can host multiple availability groups. And here the failover is at the availability group level. So if I have 4 databases that are supporting an application, I can put those into an application-specific availability group and fail them all over together. If I've got an accounting app and, say, a billing app, I can have an accounting AG and a billing AG running on the same instance, and then fail them over independently of one another. The way that AGs work is as log blocks are being written to the primary, those log blocks are transferred to the secondary or secondaries. And that log traffic can be synchronous or asynchronous. The general use case, or the architecture that you'll see from Microsoft is I've got 2 data centers. In my primary data center, I have 2 replicas, a primary and a secondary, that are running synchronous, and that is there for high availability. And then I have a second data center that is some distance from data center 1, and I'm running async there. And that is there for disaster recovery. And the reason for this is that when you're running synchronous, there is a notification that goes back to the primary that log blocks have been applied to confirm that you're not going to have any data loss if you fail over. With async, there is no notification. So if you force a failover to an asynchronous replica, you can potentially have data loss. And secondary replicas can be set to be read-only. I already talked through this about sync. You won't get data loss. And you can also set failover to be automatic. So if something goes wrong with your primary node, it will automatically fail over to the secondary. With async, it is a manual failover process. And if you want to do a planned failover to an async node, you flip it to sync, let everything sync, and then force the failover. So our AG demo, which hopefully will go smoother than the log shipping. So once again, we're looking at Azure Data Studio on a notebook, and to show you what I've got, I have 2 servers. One is running the Wide World Importers database. The other currently has no user databases. Let's refresh that, show you I don't want to pick up my sleeve. And then also on both sides, I don't have any jobs outside of this is policy purge history job. So I am going to, there's a list of prerequisites here. You got to have 2 servers that are joined to a Windows Server failover cluster. You've got to be running either Enterprise or Developer Edition because this is an enterprise feature. You should have the same log and data paths. You don't have to, but I've seen where you don't, and it's a nightmare to figure out where files are supposed to go. So it is a very, very recommended practice to have your log and data paths the same between all replicas. And then you've got to enable always on availability groups for each instance. You can do this from SQL Server Configuration Manager. It's a tab on the SQL Server service, and you can only enable it once the server hosting the instance is joined to a cluster. You can also do this through DBA Tools using the enabled DBA HADR. And then you've got to have each database you're going to add to the AG has to be in full recovery, and you have to have run a full backup. If you don't do those things, you won't meet the prerequisites and the add will fail. And then finally, this is going to use automatic seeding. So when when availability groups were introduced in 2012, you had to take a full backup and a log backup from your primary and apply it to your secondaries and have those secondary databases in no recovery. With 2016, they introduced automatic seeding, which basically, once you tell it, I want to build an availability group, it will behind the scenes start pushing that data over to your secondaries automatically. So I'm using that because that's the simplest way to set up an AG. And there's a link here in the notebook to other seeding options. So I'm going to build the AG. Once again, I got my parameters block, my primary, my secondary, my AG name, the database I want to include, and I can provide a comma limited list here. My seeding mode is automatic. And then these next two settings, prior to 2014, the only thing that would force an AG failover is an issue at the instance level. In 2014, they added a database health trigger or flag. So if one of the databases in your availability group is unhealthy, that will force a failover with this set to true. And then also they added support for distributed transaction coordinator. So this will enable DTC support. And then the confirm equals false just says, don't ask me any questions, just build the AG. So new DBA availability group is the command. So I will run this. And I'll try it one more time because that went too quick. Refresh here. Don't know that the demo gods are going to be any friendlier on this one. Okay, so it has built the availability group. So it's showing up on the primary side. Do a refresh here. You can see that I've got my worldwide importers database and it is restoring. And I should see my AG name here. All right, so it is in the process of restoring. Give this a minute. It should come back. Refresh. Restoring. Completed. Now. All right. Okay, so it built the AG out. And you can see here on my secondary side that worldwide importers shows as synchronized. And what that means is that it is up to date. So if I right click on the AG name and say show dashboard, it's going to show me a dashboard. And here everything is green. And you can see here my failover readiness is no data loss because everything's synchronized. So as activity is hitting on the primary side, it's going to push that activity over to the secondary side, send that notification back, and I'll be good to fail over without data loss. There is a concept in an availability group called a listener. So because you can set up an availability group to fail over automatically, if your application is connected to the primary node and you fail over, any connections to that database are going to fail. So there is a resource called a listener, and the listener is kind of akin to a CNAME in terms of Active Directory and DNS, where regardless of where that availability group is running, the listener will point to the primary. So I'm going to run this to create a listener. Time. that showed up. Yes. All right, so I've now created my listener, and if I connect, let me copy it. FPGA data. So I am connected to the primary. And if I was connecting an application, I was connecting to the database using a connection string on failover, it would connect to the new primary. So that is what the listener is there for. And then there is a DBATools command called sync DBA availability group. Because one of the challenges with availability groups is because the availability group is what is failing over, unlike an FCI, anything that's in your master or your MSDB database does not fail over when the availability group fails over. So sync DBA availability group will run and it will sync those objects, the objects that you tell it to sync. So I'm going to run another DBATools command called install DBA maintenance solution. And what this is going to do is it's going to install Ola Hollengren's maintenance solution on my primary. If it's there, it's going to replace it and it's going to install all the jobs. That. See if that worked. Time. I'm looking at the wrong instance. All right, so you can see I've got my 4 database backup jobs, integrity checking jobs, and my index optimized jobs. It's also created the store procedures and tables that run behind the scenes. So this will just show me what agent jobs are out there. And you can see that I'm looking for my database maintenance jobs, and the only things I see are on the O1, on my primary. There's nothing on the secondary side. So then I'm going to run sync DBA availability group, give it my primary, my secondary, my AG name, and then I'm excluding everything except for agent jobs in this case. These are all of the things that you can sync. SP configure settings, database mail settings, logins, login permissions, all this stuff having to do with the agent. All I'm interested in here is agent jobs. So I will run this. And we will see if that works. And it did. So it's now pushed all of those jobs over to the secondary. So now if I was to fail over and I expected my database backup jobs to run, they would run successfully on the same schedule as they run on the primary. And then finally, I'm going to fail my availability group over. So you can set this up to fail over automatically. Here I'm going to force a failover, and I give it my new primary, which is currently the secondary, my old primary, the AG name, and then invoke DBA AG failover is the command to do the failover. And then finally, I've got to resume data movement. So right now, data is moving from the primary to the secondary. When you invoke a manual failover, it will stop that data transfer because it wants you to verify that everything looks the way you expect it to before you start transferring data again. So that's what this resume DBA AG data movement is going to do. For some reason, Azure Data Studio will lag behind in the results it shows here. So that's what's going on. Refresh this. And you can see that I am now primary on the O2. So that failover ran successfully. And if we look at the dashboard here, you can see that the primary instance is now showing as the O2, and I'm only seeing information about the O1 node here because it is secondary. So if I was to pull up the dashboard from the O2, you'll see that with replicas and everything is green. So that failover happened, and it's now transferring from the O2 back to the O1. That is the end of my demo here. Any questions about AGs and DBATools?
My guess, it doesn't work for standard edition at all.
It doesn't work for standard edition. Standard edition has what's called basic availability groups, which is effectively mirroring. So you can only run a single AG on an instance, and that AG can only contain one database, and there's no read-only functionality on the secondary side. So it is effectively mirroring. Mirroring is, it's supposed to be deprecated, but from what I understand, Microsoft isn't going to deprecate anything anymore. But that's what basic availability groups are.
Got it.
So what was I waiting on for? Oh, looking the log shipping recovery. Let's see if that worked finally. Refresh. Yes. So I manually ran the invoke DB log ship recovery, and it put the ls test dr database. It is now recovering. So I should be able to come over here. Select from that new primary table. I've got the two rows that I expected to see that were there before, but now I can run an insert into the table in that database. And if I rerun my select, I now have 3 rows. Why my identity column is going goofy like that, I'm not sure, but just shows that it is now writable on the former secondary side. And then just for my own sanity, I'm going to restart the SQL service on my primary side. So I believe that is what I've got. So just to go over what we've covered, just an overview of DBATools, what it is, the high availability options available in SQL Server, and then how to configure log shipping, pull back information about FCIs, and configure availability groups with DBATools. The resources deck or resources slide, I've got a link to the DBATools homepage, to that commands, the download options, and then more detailed information about log shipping, FCIs, and availability groups. And then finally, a link to that DBATools in a month of lunches. And one other thing I'll show you very quickly that I love about DBATools, if we come out to tools page. So this is the home page. I go to commands. If we look at availability groups, so invoke DBA AG failover. If I click this link, it takes me to the documentation. So it gives me all the parameters that can be passed, gives me a list of examples, describes those parameters. But here at the very bottom of every one of these pages, there is a link to GitHub, to the source code. Click this, takes me through, and I can actually see the code that runs behind that command. So this can be really useful if you run one of these and it doesn't do exactly what you're expecting it to. You can figure out what it's doing. And it's also a great tutorial for PowerShell, because the people who write this code are very, very good at writing PowerShell code. So if you're trying to learn PowerShell code, you can see some good examples of how to do things. So it's, as I said, it's one of the coolest things on the internet for a lot of reasons, but this is a main one that they have visibility. And if you start using this and you see something that you think would be useful, you can reach out to them, and they are always looking for contributors. So it's a cool thing. once again, my contact information, and that is all I've got for tonight. Any other questions?
I guess we don't have any questions down here. Steve, any questions on the live social media streams?
No. That being said, I got 2 emails from people that were registered on Eventbrite saying, repeating the same timeout problem. So people couldn't log in. But again, there is not much we can do. Hopefully with recording, people can pick up that content. But and I tweeted Microsoft, and that said that they have a problem. So
Frank, I got a question for you.
Yes.
With regard to, you were talking earlier, or you were answering a question earlier where the AG for standard versus enterprise was, basically mirroring. I can't really deny that. I mean, we're only talking about one database on either side. But is there when you start looking at some of these things between the licensing costs and all the other stuff, does it make sense? Does even the simplified AG make more sense than log shipping, or any other option for a disaster recovery situation?
I mean, it depends. It all depends what your requirements are. I can add a link to basic availability groups to the slide deck before I send the link over. But it just depends what you're looking for. So one thing from a licensing perspective, if you have an enterprise agreement with software assurance, you are given, basically you can have one warm standby for an availability group. So if I've got a 2 replica availability group and I'm not doing any reading from that secondary, but the license for the primary covers that secondary. And once you start using that data, that you do require a license for the secondary. So it's all down to the cost benefit. Are you going to benefit from the ability to stand up with high availability and disaster recovery using an availability group? Does that justify that additional licensing cost? Or are there other things that you can do? Mirroring, failover clustering, log shipping. This all basically, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Thomas Grosser. He's a guy who was very active in the community, but he worked with Microsoft to develop this technology because he was the lead data architect for a company called bwin, which is the largest online betting site in the world, and they can't have any downtime at all. And so I saw him talk about AGs, I think it might have been one 2012 released, and they had just this insane architecture of log shipping and mirroring and failover clustering, and data was going every which way. And so availability groups really simplified that.
That excessive complexity, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, it depends. And like I said, I'll drop this link in the resources before I send it over.
Thank you.
No problem.
When we start talking about high availability and disaster recovery, the AGs do have that limitation with regard to the distance right between them. I think it's like 20 miles, 100 miles, something like that. Between different pieces of the data center, if you will.
Yeah.
And then after that, it starts taking a dive. So what do you see? What do you see as one of the better solutions, if you will? When you're within the data center versus when you're, you've got a data center and you have a backup data center.
So like that standard architecture is the three replicas. I've got 2 replicas running in that primary data center, and because those are sitting in the same rack or sitting in the same room, that latency is almost non-existent.
Yeah.
So you can do that automatic failover there, and then that second data center you are running async, and that gives you that disaster recovery. So if somebody cuts the power or cuts the network cable to your primary data center, you can then fail over to the DR site. And it, as with any other disaster recovery option, you need to figure out what your RTO and RPO are, and just be ready to deal with a certain level of data loss in the event that you have to force that failover. The other thing, that you can use that secondary site for, because you can set a secondary to be read-only, you can offload both reporting. If you have a reporting workload, you can offload it to that secondary site. And then you can also offload your backups to a secondary to take that workload off of your primary OLTP nodes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
No problem. Yeah, this is a fun one. DBATools is a lot of fun to work with. I'm sorry that the log shipping demo went a little south, but I will get these. Steve, can I send you, basically I'll just send you a link to the GitHub repository that the stuff lives in.
GitHub repository is perfect. This way you get the credit and people go to you for any additional information that they need.
Yeah. Yep. And if anybody has any questions, I'm always happy to answer them. All right.
I'm going to stop live stream.
All right.
Right. I guess in terms of questions, that's we don't have any more questions so far. Thank you very much for that great session. Steve, Frank, really appreciate your time today at the Los Angeles Data Platform User Group.
Thank you very much. Yes, great presentation. Really appreciate it.
All right. Have a good night.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.